Okay, so some people may also be watching on Facebook, and some people may be signed in, but wherever you're coming from, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. Just quick introduction, my name is Jen Scott. I'm a Senior Gender Advisor at IFC, working on sustainable infrastructure. And I have with me today my colleagues, Adriana, who's actually my boss. She's the gender lead at IFC Infrastructure, and also Gabriella, who is a specialist in data, and she's going to be helping us with the slides. We're really looking forward to this session. The purpose of our session today is we're going to explore this fascinating world of gender and data. And so some quick housekeeping to start with. The session today will be 1 hour, and the presentation will hopefully take up about 45 minutes, 45 minutes. And then at the end, we're aiming to have some time left for questions. But that said, you might have questions or thoughts or comments as we go. So if you're on the Zoom link with us, please feel free to pop your question in the chat box and we will try to get to it. And we'll also make the slides available that we have up today. So if you're not able to join live, then there'll be something afterwards. So some of you may already know something about these topics, about gender and about data, or about both gender and data. And for some of you, it may be entirely new, and that's okay. Whatever point of knowledge you're joining us from is fine. It's aimed at a sort of introductory level, but hopefully there'll be something useful that you can take away, even if you are something of an expert. And just so quickly, if you are signed in and can access the chat, we would love to hear who you are and what your background is and what you're hoping to get out of the session today. So if you have a chance, please feel free to use the chat and pop that in the chat box. That'd be really helpful for us. So before we go into the outline of the topics that we're going to cover, we have a little warm-up exercise for you. And since this presentation is about data, we thought we could start with a little survey. And this is not anything to be alarmed about, so no specialist knowledge is required. And you'll see that on the next slide. Okay, so as you can see, it's not a particularly serious survey, but the question we have for you is, how is everyone feeling today? So on the screen, you can see 7 very different sheep. Florence says she's very interested in this topic. Me too. Please take a moment to look at each photo and decide which sheep best represents you today. Adriana's coming in strong at number 1 with the sunglasses. Gabriella's number 5. I think I'm probably number 4 because that's what I feel like when I'm presenting. Anyone else? Number 5. Okay, good. So nobody said number 6, which is the sheep that is hopefully asleep but could be dead. And nobody said number 3, which is the sheep with a bucket on its head. So that's good. Okay, we've got another person, number 1. Fab. Well, this is a very good start. Number 5, got a few 5s, few 1s. Okay, perfect. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Great, so now we have the ball rolling. Let's quickly touch on the subjects that we're going to cover. So we're going to start off with some numbers and a few case studies to just give you an idea of the relevance of these topics to absolutely every aspect of everyday life. And then we're going to briefly talk about gender. So we're going to say some definitions of what gender is and the legacy of the world that we've inherited along the lines of gender. And then we're going to look at, why does gender particularly matter now? Why is it specifically important in the digital age? And how does that overlap with data? And next, we'll discuss a little bit about gender in data science and the gender gaps in data science. And then we're going to see some of the ways that gender smart or gender aware data can bring huge value to many, many diverse areas of life and also work. And then we'll end with some practical tips for interacting with data in a gender smart way, whether you are generating data, collecting it, analyzing it, or benefiting from its use. And then after the presentation, as mentioned, we'll have some time for questions, for any questions. And we'll also leave you with some suggestions of resources that you can look into to further explore these topics. And also, when we get to the end of the presentation, we really encourage you to unmute yourself and put on your camera if you feel so inclined to show your face, and share any questions or thoughts that you have with us. So I'm turning my camera off just for doing the presentation. It's a little bit easier, but I will pop it back on at the end of the presentation and encourage you to do the same. And so we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so let's start with going back to the basics for a moment. So what is data? Does anyone want to venture a definition for what data is? So feel free to pop an answer in the chat, or if you want to chime in, unmute yourself and share a thought with us. Data is a table with numbers. Okay, cool. That's a good starting point. Yeah, that is partly what data is. Data is information. Yeah, absolutely. Data is information. Any other thoughts? So we think about a really broad definition that would cover everything from tables to information to numbers. Data is the new oil. Wow, I like that. Yes, that is definitely true. Data is the new oil. That's great. I'm going to write that one down actually for my next presentation. So according to the dictionary, a broad definition would be data is things known or assumed as facts, making the basis of reasoning or calculation. So in other words, data is the building blocks for how we construct our map of reality. It's how we understand the world and how we make sense of the reality around us. So based on this understanding of the world, based on data, we can then take action and solve problems. So just bear that in mind for a moment. And I'd like to show you some numbers that can help to demonstrate why data is such an important component when we think about harnessing the power of information to solve problems. So more than anything else, these numbers highlight how much there is to lose from failing to factor gender into data, into our map of reality and how we understand the world. So this first number is 10 with a huge number of zeros after it. And that is actually 10 trillion. So it's $10 trillion, and $10 trillion is the value of women's unpaid care work globally. So that means that if women were paid for all the care work that they do, looking after children, looking after older people, looking after sick people, looking after the house, it would be worth $10 trillion. That's a huge amount of money. It's a massive portion of the global economy. So the low status given to care work and the fact that it's gendered strongly towards women results in a complex set of policy problems, including falling birth rates and significant losses in productivity. It really is a tough one. And I'm from the UK and we're grappling with it at the moment. It's very difficult. Okay, next number, please. So 47. So 47 is 47%. And that is how much more likely women are than men to die in a serious car crash, because car safety is designed and tested using crash dummies that are based on a male body. That's pretty shocking to me. Almost twice as likely to die in a serious car crash because we use these crash test dummies that are based on a male body. Yeah, it's very shocking. Yeah, exactly. Okay, next number, please. 2.3. So this one will be familiar to everyone when I tell you what it is. So 2.3 times is the amount of time by which women take longer than men to use the bathroom. And we all know this. We've all seen these huge lines outside a woman's bathroom everywhere we go in the world. And why is this? Okay, so women make up the majority of the elderly and also the disabled. Women are more likely to be taking care of children. Women menstruate. Pregnancy also increases the need by which women require to urinate, to use the bathroom more frequently. And women are also 8 times more likely to suffer urinary tract infections than men. But despite all of this, standard building and plumbing codes still dictate that there should be a 50-50 split between the number of male bathrooms and the number of female bathrooms, which again, massive inefficiencies, as we can see when we look at these huge queues for women's bathrooms. Okay, next number, please. Okay, so here we have number 5. And 5 is 5 degrees Celsius, and this is the average temperature by which a standard office environment is too cold for women, because standard office thermostats, you've guessed it, are set to the male metabolic resting rate, which is about 35% higher for men than for women, meaning men burn calories much more efficiently. They generate more heat, more body heat than women do. Men also consume more calories. So if you peg an office temperature to the male metabolic resting rate, then it will generally be too cold for most women, which is again why we see this strange phenomenon of women sitting in offices wrapped in blankets when men are kind of striding around in shorts. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. Okay, and next one, please. 3. So 3 is how many more times women are to die of cancer than men when they're exposed to the same amount of radiation. And this is for many different reasons, medical reasons, biological differences between sort of average male and average female bodies, including the fact that, interestingly, women's skin is thinner than men's skin, and their endocrine systems function slightly differently, and their bodies are also more prone to accumulating environmental toxins. But in spite of this, the regulations around the release of radioactive and harmful chemicals are based on what in medicine is described as reference man. And the reference man is a white man who is between the ages of 25 and 35, of average height, and weighs 70 kg, which for everyone who's not a reference man is not particularly helpful. And it can have really serious impacts in terms of medical research and safety assumptions, as we can see from those statistics. Okay, let's move on to slide number 5, please. Okay, so now we have an idea about what data is and why it's so central to our understanding of the world. Let's turn to look at gender. And so again, maybe it's helpful to start with a few key points. So when we talk about gender, what we are talking about are socially constructed roles, not biological sex. So those two things are sometimes easily confused. But socially, an example of a socially constructed role might be something like girls are good at cooking or boys are good at football. So these are social constructs. It's actually nothing to do with the type of body a person is born into. Some girls may be awful at cooking and amazing at football, and some boys may be great at cooking and awful at football. That's nothing to do with their actual biological sex, but gender roles are very powerful. And because they're almost invisible, they become a kind of cultural truth that determines the sort of opportunities and barriers that a person will face in their lives. And we can see this when we look at history. So we're conditioned to think of the male gender as the default and to ignore or erase the female experience. And this is a tendency that's been going on for a very long time. So for example, some female body parts For example, the ovaries weren't given a name by medicine until the late 18th century. And in the UK, where I'm from, we have more public statues that are named after men called John than there are statues of women in the entire country. And then finally, if we think about globally, educational textbooks, which every child learns from, are on average 3 times more likely to have an example of a male experience or an example of a man in the teaching points than they are to feature a woman or a girl. Okay, slide number 6, please. So why is gender and data particularly important to think about at the moment? Well, really, with the digital revolution, more of our world is designed and run by data analytics than ever before. So from government spending decisions to the creation of new products, from transport provision to the content we see in our phones, data is really actively shaping every area of our lives. And there's, along with that, a misconception maybe that data is somehow neutral or objective, that because there are numbers involved, then it's sort of clean and somehow free of bias. But actually, that's not true at all, because data management systems are designed by people, people called data scientists, and data scientists embed their values, their interests, their life experiences, and their perspectives into the data that they handle. So they end up shaping outcomes in line with their own understanding of the world. And data science is currently very heavily skewed towards men. And does anyone want to suggest reasons for why that might be the case? Any ideas? This is an open question. Any thoughts?
Because men are socialized to do STEM courses. And so obviously they still see it as an area where they are best fit.
Yeah, that's great. Yep, that's great. Very true. Anyone else? So yeah, so as Florence said, so men are definitely socialized into this kind of historical legacy of patriarchy. Until very, very recently, men dominated almost every field of decision making and culture, and the majority of data scientists are still men. And there's also something that we talk about a lot in gender work called unconscious bias. Does anyone know what unconscious bias is? It may be a phrase that's unfamiliar to you. So maybe what we can do is I'll share a riddle with you. So let's consider this one. So the riddle is as following. A father and son were involved in a car accident in which the son was seriously injured. The son was taken by ambulance to a nearby hospital and was immediately wheeled into an emergency operating room where he was met by a surgeon. Upon arrival and seeing the patient, the surgeon exclaimed, "Oh my God, it's my son." Can anyone explain this riddle? Any ideas at all? The father is a doctor. No, the father is not a doctor. So the father was in the car crash, remember? So the father was, the father did not come into the operating room. Or he has seen someone who looks like him. Okay. Nope. Yeah, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. Okay, I'm going to put you out all out your misery and explain this to you. So this riddle relates directly to unconscious bias because the surgeon is, of course, the boy's mother. But most people who hear this riddle automatically assume that a surgeon has to be a male. Yeah. So I wanted to share this just to get us starting to think about our own biases and sometimes how these assumptions can be quite deeply seated. So gender assumptions are harmful because they can obviously hold us back from optimizing the talent and opportunities around us. And I also want to say at this point that even some people who work full-time as gender specialists don't figure this riddle out straight away. So if you didn't figure it out, there's absolutely no shame in that. But it does illustrate how important it is for all of us to question our own biases. Okay, and the next slide, please. Right, so let's have a think about gender in data science. So as someone, I think it was Lynn, mentioned earlier in the presentation, data is the new oil, and that's very true. So jobs in data and data science in the digital economy, particularly in fields like machine learning or artificial intelligence, these are among some of the highest paid careers globally and the careers that are most in demand. And women in the United States in these fields hold less than 20% of positions, so 18%. And if that's the case in the United States, you can imagine it's far, far lower in other parts of the world with maybe a less robust university education system and fewer opportunities for women. So we'd imagine in sub-Saharan Africa, those rates are very, very low indeed. There's a lot of reasons for why this might be the case. And some of them that we might want to consider could include cultural norms, which we've discussed a little bit earlier. So this idea that science is for boys, and just a lack of awareness on the part of girls and their families that dissuades them from entering into what we call STEM, so science, technology, and engineering educational fields. And another reason could be just the unwelcoming environment in male-dominated STEM fields, both in terms of education and also in terms of the final workplace. It's really not set up to accommodate men and women. And then another reason could be what we call the digital gender divide. So that's when women and girls have less access to smart devices and the means to get online, and also fewer digital skills, often because they drop out science subjects at school. And they may also have lower literacy as compared with both boys and men. And then a related point, which is really important to flag for anyone who's collecting any kind of data, or anyone, in fact, who's engaging with populations digitally, so using digital tools, it's really important to know that participants will likely be starting from quite different places in terms of their existing skills and capacities, and also the time and resources they have to dedicate to learning. And that can vary according to things like age, education, gender, income, family situation, and a whole host of other factors. So it's just really important to be considerate of that if you are using digital platforms to gather data or to otherwise engage. And so if we did a lot more, then we can conclude from this slide, if we did a lot more to recruit women into data science and also educated all data scientists on gender issues, not only female data scientists, it would really help to reduce bias, including unconscious bias, by introducing a much more diverse set of experiences and perspectives into the teams that work with data. So we'll explore this topic a little bit more in the next slide. So here we want to think about why is gender smart data so valuable? So what are some of the reasons for this, what we call the business case? I think the first one to touch on is that gender informed or gender smart data does lead to greater insights, and harnessing those insights create products and services that in the end function better for users. So a good example of this could be a few years back, there was a whole data set that came out in the UK showing that female drivers were less likely statistically to get into accidents as compared with male drivers. And that data set then enabled insurers to start offering female-only car insurance with lower premiums than they were offering to men. So this saved consumers money, and it saved insurance providers money, and also helped to generate a more efficient market for car insurance. A second example could be when we think about public policy making and more efficient allocation of taxpayers' money. So an example here is a topic that we work on quite a lot in our work at the IFC, something called smart cities. So if we think about gender data in smart cities, mapping use of public transport and understanding routes taken by men and women, and also the perceptions of safety among men and women. And that sort of information enables a city authority, a municipal authority, to take actions like increasing transport provision in underserved areas, or changing the timing of services to better coincide with when women and men each need to commute. Also looking at safety issues, maybe increasing surveillance by putting better cameras or street lighting in areas that are sort of underlit or perceived as dangerous, or maybe even increasing policing. So all of these actions that can be taken to improve policy making and public services come from being able to have data that really targets and understands the demographic. And then the third reason could be gender smart data helps to improve retention in a company and also generate a more productive workforce. So again, a lot of the work we do with our clients, with the companies we work with, we do what's called a gender assessment. And that is when we apply gender analysis to every aspect of the company's operation to generate insights that enables the company management to boost recruitment of a more diverse workforce. So how can they, if they are underrepresented in terms of fewer women than men in the workforce, how can they start to address that? And we know we've got a lot of data that shows that having a more gender diverse workforce increases innovation, it increases productivity, it increases profitability, and just makes for a happier workplace. So we have quite substantial numbers to back all of that up now. Okay, and next slide, please. So we're now going to switch gears a little bit and think practically. So how can we include data at every stage of what we call the data value chain? I'm not sure how clear you can see that diagram, but basically this is a schematic that shows how data is generated from the very sort of initial stage of thinking about framing your research, to collecting your data, to analyzing your data, to using your data, and then to think about the sort of impacts that applying that data has in the real world. So we'll start by talking about framing research, which is the next slide. So framing research means essentially deciding what kinds of questions you want to ask, and also in the process, questioning your assumptions about how different people will respond. And ideally, you do this through wide consultation with a diverse sample of people prior to designing your research. So that would be questions like, just to give you a few examples, do men and women have the same sort of access to things like money or land or work? Do men and women face the same risks in relation to development or land loss? Do men and women have the same ability to benefit from new opportunities such as jobs or finance or scholarships? And if there are gender differences that come up, then you know at this stage of framing your research, it will be really important to measure them, to explore why they exist, and also to look at the sort of impacts that they have. So we'll now move on to think about data collection, which is the next stage. So the most important thing to bear in mind when you're collecting data is to record the biological sex of your data subjects. So your data subjects are the people whom you're collecting data from. And most data, especially in large samples, is collected anonymously. It may be, it may not be, but if you're collecting quantitative data, often is collected anonymously, but you can still collect the biological sex of each respondent. And we'll see why when we go on to the next slide. But another point for data collection is that you want to aim for the same proportion of women and men in your data sample as in the target population you're interested in understanding. So it's easier to demonstrate this by way of example. So say, for instance, you're interested in understanding public transport users. And you know that around 60% of all public transport users are women between the ages of 45 and 60 years old. So if you go out to sample that population, your sample should ideally contain around 60% of women who are between the ages of 45 to 60 years old. So you can extrapolate that way. And then when you're thinking about your methodology for data collection, there are other important considerations from a gender perspective. So ensuring that the timing, the location, the format are all equally accessible for men and for women. So considering issues like access to digital technology, the level of literacy, also the level of trust and safety that people may have in providing information, particularly if it's sensitive information and you're gathering it face to face. And then finally, if you are doing face-to-face or in-person data collection, it's worth thinking about whether you want to train your data collectors in gender-sensitive data collection, which is a whole other kind of topic that we can provide you more information on if you're interested. And then B, whether it's worthwhile actually specifically recruiting female data collectors to go and talk to women. And this may be particularly applicable in situations where culturally it's not very easy for an unknown male to, for example, go into the home and talk to a woman about her family or about something personal. So it's also worth bearing in mind when you're at the stage of collecting or planning to collect your data, whether any of these topics apply. So we'll now move on to data analysis. And so data analysis, as we said in the previous slide, if you collect your data and you make sure you record the biological sex of all of the data subjects, then you will be able to perform something called gender disaggregated data analysis. So that means looking for any patterns in the data collected according to whether people are male or woman, male or female. So some examples would be you could assess how the gender division of labor and patterns of decision making operate in terms of impacting a particular policy or a project. You could look at who has access to and control over resources or assets or benefits. You could look at whether there are any differences between men and women in terms of barriers and constraints to participate in, for example, a particular service. And you can also assess whether there are opportunities and entry points for change and for improvement. Do we have any questions that popped? I thought I saw a few questions. Adriana, are there any questions, or should we keep going and do the questions at the end?
I think we have two questions for now.
Okay.
And I can read them if you want.
Well, so we've only got a couple of slides left, so maybe we'll just
okay.
Yeah, maybe we'll just push through, and then we can tackle those questions that have come up, and then also if anyone else has any other questions, we can dive into those.
Sure.
So great. So the next slide, please. So the final stage of the data value chain is data application and use. So here we can think about how can data help to reduce gender inequalities when it's used wisely. So one way could be in helping to create systems to circumvent bias. So an example of this would be, for example, if you are gathering data on men and women who work in a particular job, so say something like male and female accountants, and for doing the same job, you find out that if you look at the data, which is often the case actually, women earn less than men do with the same level of qualifications and in the same position. And this is what we refer to as the gender pay gap. And so if you have data that clearly shows that, then you can begin to put in place a system to redress that. So you can put in place, if you're a company, you can put in place policies for equal pay for equal work. You can carry out a review of salaries and correct any discrepancies, and you can make sure that going forward, HR offers the same level of starting salary to someone regardless of their gender. You can, secondly, think about predictive analytics. So that means thinking about how we can use data to forecast and prevent gender gaps from even arising. So if we look at, for example, numbers of women dropping out the workforce, and we start to understand why they might be dropping out the workforce, we can put in place policies and incentives to make sure that they are supported to stay in their jobs. And then we can think about an education as well. So this is a big one, training more women and girls in digital and data capabilities so that we don't have these huge gaps in terms of only 18% or lower of women in data science, which is the new oil and also a hugely influential field that's reshaping every aspect of our world. So we're approaching the end of our presentation. The next slide, I think. Here we have some suggested resources for anyone who's interested in further learning. I'm conscious that we've kind of rocketed through quite a lot of material and dipped into many different topics. But to start with, I can't recommend highly enough this book, Invisible Woman: Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. Some of the figures that I shared in the introduction are from that book. And it's a wonderful kind of expose of all of the ways in which we are surrounded by these data gaps and gender data gaps, and how we can think about beginning to redress them. So if you're interested at all, it's a very lively, entertaining read. And then the next one we have is the World Bank's Gender Data Portal. So this is a very rich, powerful website in the sense of offering a huge amount of insight into many, many different topics. And it will, for any given topic, so for example, if you're interested in education or health or ease of doing business or whatever it is, entrepreneurship, whatever it is you're interested in, you can have a look at that data portal, and it will give you all kinds of wonderful graphs and charts and statistics and numbers, gender disaggregated data for each of these topics, and a whole bunch of other things besides. So that one's really worth a play around on. The next link down is for something called the Data ×2 project, which is it's an initiative that's been set up to support international organizations to look more closely at gender gaps and all of the work that they do. So that's quite interesting to look at and think about from an applied perspective of how does some of this look out in the world when you start to try and mainstream it into projects. And then we have a video. So some of you may be familiar with this already. If not, it's a very powerful, very short animated video called The Girl Effect. And that really, it's not specific to data, but you can kind of see the impacts of data woven through it. If you think about, it tells the story of one example, individual girl who's 12 years old and traces two potential trajectories for her life. And the reason it's called The Girl Effect is because this one particular story could be multiplied, and is multiplied millions of times over when you think about all the girls and young women in a similar situation. So that one is a powerful and very interesting little short video to check out. And then finally, there's a report from UN Women, making women and girls visible, gender data gaps and why they matter. That's really more of a kind of in-depth exploration of quite a few of the topics and ideas that we've covered today. So if you are interested in kind of reading that at your leisure and maybe looking at their reference section, they have a bibliography with a whole bunch of other resources that we haven't covered here. So that one's a really good place to start for continuing your reading. And then finally, on the last slide, we just want to share our contact details. So Adriana, who's my boss, and me, and we're both working on gender issues with the Infrastructure Natural Resources team, IFC, and these are our email addresses. So if you've joined us today, or if you're watching the replay and you have questions or thoughts, you'd like to get in touch, please do reach out to us. We're available. And with that, I will wrap up and hand over to Adriana and Gabriella to see if there are any questions.
Yes, thanks for the presentation, Jen. I think we have a couple of questions in the chat. And just, there's one question. How different is do you get different results in terms of the gender of data collectors? And how different is this from collecting data online?
That's a really interesting question. It's like a two-part question. So if I understand it correctly, do you get different results depending on whether the data collectors are male or female? That's the first part of the question. Yes, you can do. You definitely can do. And this is particularly relevant, I think, in some cultural contexts where there are certain issues that are taboo for women to talk about openly with, particularly with men that they don't know. And if we think about things that are very sensitive, like gender-based violence or other family issues, personal issues, a lot of issues around women's health, any issue that may be perceived as shameful, even issues around money and family finances. I mean, for anyone, regardless of where you are in the world, to be approached by a stranger and asked about topics that are very close to your sense of identity and your sense of self and your emotional well-being, that's a really difficult thing to do. And what we have seen is that it tends to be easier, not always, but it tends to be easier to train up female data collectors to go into homes when that's the methodology used and talk to women face to face, as opposed to a man that they don't know. Also, the family tends to be more comfortable with that. So we have seen differences that way. I mean, it really depends. And then the second part of the question, I think, was about whether it's different online as well. Is that correct? Yeah. Yes. I mean, I think the online part of it is interesting because online, in some respects, you'd imagine might help to eliminate some of the awkwardness of dealing face to face if you're just filling out a form and you're doing so anonymously, and that certainly could be true. But just one word of caution online is that we do see quite a lot of gender discrepancies in terms of the inability of women maybe to access a smart device. So women tend to have to use a lot more in emerging markets. Certainly, they tend to use more the what's
basic
the name
phones.
of it? The dumb phone, the basic phone.
The basic phones.
The basic phone, the Nokia phone, the brick, which I actually have as well. I like that one. But less the digital, the smart technology. So they may not have that interface, and also they may be less likely to be they're just less likely to be online statistically. We still know that that's a big gap. So they may not be as familiar with different softwares or with how to kind of respond to things. They may not have the time during the day if it's a set slot. They may need to be more flexible if they're kind of juggling childcare and work and all these other things. So so the digital, I think the digital forum is very promising in terms of being a bit more neutral, but it needs careful thinking through so that you don't inadvertently alienate anyone or exclude anyone.
I just want to add to what Jen said related to having both female and male collectors. Sometimes, you know, it depends very much also on the timing when this data collection is happening, because if it is during the day, usually men are at work and there will be women to respond to the survey, and they will be more comfortable to talk to a woman than to talk to a man and invite the man inside. Ideally, they should work in pairs, because if there is the case to have the survey on a household level and interview more people, the women collectors can take the women of the household, and the men collectors can talk to the men. So it's always, and it depends very much, as Jen mentioned, on the culture. Yes.
I think we have another question from the chat. How can the gender disparity be bridged without making it look like women are fighting for the same treatment rather than fair treatment of both genders?
How can so without making it look like women are fighting? So I think if I'm interpreting that correctly, the question is asking how can the disparity be bridged without the perception that women are being favored, when actually what they're asking for is equal treatment. Is that right? I'm not sure who asked that question, but I mean, I think
yes,
as you, yeah, was that your question, Isaac? Did I get that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. No, I mean, and this is a really interesting topic. We do get this quite a lot, and particularly, I mean, I'm sure Adriana is familiar with it. I used to go out and do a lot of field work in communities, and you would quite often get pushback from men who'd just say, you know, why are you doing all this stuff for the woman, and where's our stuff, and you know, where, you know, what do we get? And I mean, I think there's a few responses to that, and one thing that we've learned is that if we have an initiative or an awareness campaign or a kind of an effort to engage women, we always try to involve men in that. So either by consulting them or by recruiting them as champions and allies, or by making them aware that it's going on, or offering something in parallel. So it's not seen as, I mean, in reality, it's not favoritism, because we're kind of bringing this up to here rather than kind of here. But, you know, somebody has said, and many people have said recently, you know, if you're used to privilege, then equality feels like an attack. And there is that sentiment. So I think approaching people as collaboratively as possible, explaining what you're doing, why you're doing it, and trying to recruit men actively as allies and supporters, because everyone has a mother. You know, many people have daughters, many people have sisters. And actually, as we can see from some of the examples, it's not just in the interest of women to have this disparity closed, it's in the interest of everyone. Because having gender informing the data that is used to make decisions about the world around us, and having the people who are creating the data systems both have a male perspective and a female perspective on the world actually creates a more accurate model of reality for everyone. So it's not a question of fighting over a scarce resource. It should be about making a larger pie for everyone to share. But I don't know, Adriana, maybe you have other thoughts on that.
Now, communication is very important, because we have to remember that gender is not about just women. In some societies, women may be at disadvantage, but in other societies, men can be at disadvantage, or boys. You know, for example, in Mongolia, there is more dropout of boys from school than girls. So if somebody wants to ensure that the opportunities are shared between boys and girls, something needs to be done to intervene to help the boys to stay in school. So the way we communicate is reminding everybody that this is not just sharing the pie, as Jen said, but it's increasing the pie. So everybody contributes, everybody has something to benefit of. And it's also about giving access to everybody to the interventions. For example, when we were working in the field, Jen and I, we're working with the mining sector, and a lot of benefits were going to men, and a lot of risks were bearing by women and children. So we take a more focus on women type of interventions. And even they were like life skills, like baking and cooking or agriculture, we didn't just invite women to participate, we invited also men to participate. And that actually helped a lot to get the endorsement of the whole community to work together and not to have to be seen as we are basically doing something just for the women and leave out the men. Hope this it's a response to what you asked.
No, it's good, and I thanks, Adriana. I see there's also Isaac popped in the chat just now, a follow-up question, which is another very good question. We've got a couple more questions. We've got 5 minutes left, so we try and get both of them done before we end the session. Also see one from Princess as well. But sorry, so let me pull this up. Isaac says, in Africa, the experience is that women, ladies and girls are rarely interested in STEM or the sciences and digital spaces, unlike the male gender. How best can the female also be socialized to have and develop similar or same interests in the digital spaces? That is an interesting question. And I think there's a few things to say on that from my perspective. I mean, I don't know if you want to dive into that first, Adriana, or if you want me to.
Yeah, I can do that. It's
Okay.
I think it is to increase the basically women interest on this. The most effective instrument that we've seen and we use in other countries was to actually identify women role models, like champions already working in the system, and also fathers and husbands and boyfriends of women that are already involved in STEM, and put in place a campaign basically showing that it's okay to be interested in this. It's okay to go for education in technical jobs. It's okay to participate in this. And we also work with the education institutions, vocational trainings or facilities or universities to basically put in place facilities to help women to stay in school, not only to get in the school, but to stay in school, because sometimes they will start school like faculty and at that they will marry and have a child, and they will drop out because they cannot leave the child with anybody. So we encourage the universities to have like childcare facilities and help the young mothers. If you have anything to add, Jen.
Yeah, I do. I just want to do a quick time check. Florence, if you're there, or someone from Mobile Web Ghana. I know we've just got 1 minute left. Are we able to run over slightly by 5 minutes or so? Because I see we've got a couple more questions coming into the chat. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
great.
It's okay.
Great. So yeah, just to, I mean, I think that's really well put, Adriana. The only thing I would maybe add, which I find fascinating, is that if you look at boys and girls anywhere in the world, and actually also women and men, but most of the data is in boys and girls, you don't see any differences in aptitude and ability between girls and boys in terms of science and maths. So that's completely bogus. There's no difference in aptitude. But what you do see is a trend that women are more interested in people and men are more interested in things. And so one way of attracting more women into data science is to make data science more relevant to people, make data science more relevant to what women are interested in. So it's about bringing it alive and showing in applied ways, how can you use data to improve educational outcomes for young children? How can you use data to improve online dating algorithms? How can you use data to produce a better public transport system? Something that is relevant to the way that people live their lives and understand each other and understand the world around them. So I think some of that will also come in the way that it's explained and taught and marketed to people, these opportunities. That it's not just about sitting in front of a computer coding numbers. It's about actually people and relationships and being, involved in shaping the world. Okay, next, should we go to the next question?
Yeah, there is a question from Princess. In your line of work, have you been able to track the process of development in a particular field from data over a period of 5 or 10 years?
Do you want to go for that one, Adriana?
Yeah, you go ahead first.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, ideally, everything that we do has what we call an M&E plan, which is monitoring and evaluation. So whatever sort of intervention we're looking at, when we design it, we take a baseline, which is collecting a data points to show the status of the current situation. So say, for example, we're looking at recruiting women into a particular company, into management positions in a company. We would take a baseline study where we would see the proportion and number of women at the start, and then we might recommend some measures to implement, for example, doing more kind of active recruitment through networks, or educating, kind of public education campaign, or increasing mentoring schemes, or putting in place better family leave policies, or any of these sort of measures we might recommend the company adopt. And then we measure again after a year, after 5 years, after 10 years, to see what sort of difference those measures have made. And it's always a bit of an inexact science, because, we can never truly prove that it's due to our measures that those changes have happened. But we're pretty confident a lot of the time when we're looking at something like that, where we understand the variables that have led to the problem, and we take action to try and improve things, and then we measure again. So that is the way that we work. And you can see this. I mean, the World Bank Gender Data Portal website actually will show you historically the type of improvements that we've seen in things like maternal mortality, education of girls, life expectancy, all of these types of data sets. You can see them over 5, 10, 15, 20-year periods, and you can see the way that the data is trending. So yeah, that's exactly how we do it.
Just to add to what Jen already said, changes, particularly around gender and increasing numbers of women in the workforce in industries that are male-dominated, or increasing women participation in communities which are very patriarchal, you don't see them on a very short time. It takes time to see the changes. So when you set up your targets where you want to see that particular work, you need to have very realistic and intermediate targets, making sure that you take steps to get there. So it's not a very linear process. Maybe let's say the final target is to increase the number of women managers in a particular company from 10 to 20. But before, you need to have a enabling environment in place. You need to have a respectful workplace. You need to have policies that should facilitate hiring and retaining of women, and you have to have programs of leadership to help them promote and so on. So all this become targets actually for in your M&E approach. I think we have another 2 questions if we still have a little bit of time.
Actually, Gabriella, would you mind?
Yeah, there's an interesting conversation going on in the chat. So the last 3 questions, do you want me to read them all or just go one by one?
Maybe we can read them all and we'll try to answer as succinctly as possible.
Okay, perfect. So first question is, how can we ensure that women overcome the increasing challenges of everyday survival from preventing them from meaningfully engaging in the public sphere? That would be the first one. Next question is there any hope that in the next generation there will be a total elimination of gender inequality or any form of bias? And the last question, how can we mainstream gender in our educational system to ensure we do not lose focus as in one sex benefiting more than the other?
So sorry, the last question, how
can we mainstream gender in our educational system to ensure we do not lose focus as in one sex benefiting more than the other?
All great questions. Adriana, do you want to jump in or shall I?
I can start with the last one.
Okay. You want to start with the last one?
Yeah, on how can we mainstream gender in the educational system. I think it's first of all, it's good to start in a particular setting with the baseline, as we mentioned earlier, and then see how the things have been historically, looking at 2 or 3 years in the past to see how it worked. And then not only starting to develop intervention, but also training the decision-making people on the educational system, on gender, on unconscious bias on gender, because sometimes, you know, we come with interventions, but actually at the decision level, decision-making level, there is no support or no understanding why this type of measures should come in, and even they are very good measures, and then may actually result in a change and in basically increasing the gender equality. As long as the people at the top don't have the understanding, things will not happen. So it's very important to open the discussion around unconscious bias, open the discussion around raising the gender awareness, and then apply specific interventions based on, and as I said, setting up realistic targets of what you want to obtain. I don't know, Jen, if you want to add anything on that.
I think that's really good. I might tackle the other the other question. So whether there's hope of completely overcoming gender inequality in the next generation. I love that question. I just think it's so important to think boldly and to think big and to be optimistic and to set aggressive goals. And I mean, I don't think any of us can know, but insofar as we can use data to predict the future, if we look historically at the way that data has trended over the last 50 years, there have been tremendous jumps. I mean, we have still a very long way to go, and also in particular places in the world, that gap is still very, very large. But if you look historically at the trend of the data, it's overwhelmingly positive. So I think realistically for the next generation, we probably will still have gender inequality, but we have less of it. And the inequalities we have are kind of being chipped away at gradually. And I personally find it very hopeful to talk to children and to talk to young people, because I think their attitudes are so much more natural around these issues. Of course, women and men should be equal. It's just why would we think otherwise? I mean, not everywhere, but a lot of young people do think like that. So I think we're seeing these improvements and we're measuring them as well. So we have the data to prove that we are. And then the first question, women overcoming everyday survival challenges. Yeah, I mean, that's a really tough one. I don't think, I mean, I haven't been working internationally for as long as Adriana, but I have almost sort of 15 years experience at this point. And over that time, I've become very suspicious of what we call magic bullets. So this idea that one solution is going to solve everything. I don't think that's true. I don't think it's ever been true. And the best we know is that solving gender equality relies on a whole series of interlinked complementary supports and interventions. So, for example, it's very difficult to quote unquote economically empower women without also politically empowering women, without having them represented in decision making. It's very difficult to improve women's outcomes in business if you don't also look at the inequalities that women face in terms of legal systems and access to land and access to resources. So I think the best that we can do is to try to take an integrated approach and tackle as many of these barriers and inequalities as possible, and know that not every person or every organization will be able to do everything. So working in partnership. But I mean, the everyday survival, I think, also speaks to this terrible problem of gender-based violence, which has been with us since the beginning of time and is still with us. And that's something, you know, we're starting now to gather a lot more evidence on. and really study as a science to understand what works. And so if anyone is specifically interested in that topic, please do reach out to us, because we have colleagues who are experts in that, and we have resources that we can direct you towards that will help you to understand that specific issue a bit better. Adriana, I don't know if you want to add anything, or if
actually before the COVID, I think based on the existing data, the time for closing the gender gap was about 65 years, and now after the pandemic started, it pulled back, and it's some of the data says 80 years, other data says 126 years. So it's still, we are still far from being able to actually close the gender gap, but that doesn't mean that it should stop us, because it's a far horizon. We should try to do as much as possible. And I see an interesting discussion following on the chat around an observation from Isaac, who says that if you put a laptop in front of a girl and a boy, the boy will look for technical things and ICT and so on, and the girl will start watching a soap opera or other things. So this is very much what we said at the beginning. Gender roles are a societal, are defined by the society, and then sometimes the gender roles are stereotype, and if we always think that girls will do more soft things and boys will do more hard things. However, if the children are given opportunities when they are very young, like instead of buying girls just dolls and kitchens to play with, and for the boys cars and construction toys, and buy them, both, they will grow up with very much interest on different things. So it's not that, it's also the unconscious bias that at very early child education, it's the educators of very early child age should also have a better understanding of the unconscious bias. And I just wanted to tell you about one metaphor about gender equality that I came across working in Papua New Guinea. They say that the humanity is a bird, and there is men are a wing and the women are the other wing. So if one of the wings is weak and not as strong as the other, the bird will not be able to fly. So that is why it's so important to have the voices and both men and women participating in development and constructing this world. I don't know, Gabriela, are any other questions for us?
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. This was a great session. I really enjoyed it. And thanks for all the wonderful questions. And as we mentioned, we shared our contact details. Please do get in touch. We'll make sure we organize to get the slides sent out to you. And yeah, hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer and Anna and Michelle for making this possible, and Gabriela as well. We have really enjoyed the session, and I personally am going to reach out.
Thank you so much for your help, Florence. All right.
Excellent. Okay.
Bye.
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 Hi, thank you, Florence.